Anne Boleyn spent much of her life becoming the first of many things. Yet by a cruel turn of fate, she also became the first queen in English history to be condemned for treason, brought before a court and executed on this very day, May 19, 1536. In today's video, together with Anne Boleyn, we'll live through the final hours of her life, from the first light of dawn to the moment she met her death at the executioner's hands. Leave a like and step into the final May morning of the most famous Tudor queen. So here we are on the morning of Friday, May 19th, within the walls of the Tower of London. Dawn has broken, the final dawn of Anne's life. Together, we'll make our way toward the White Tower, where Anne spent her last days. But this place held a far deeper meaning in her story. Just 1,000 days earlier, she had waited here for her coronation, and today, she was waiting for her death. That fact may surprise you, especially if the words Tower of London bring to mind dark dungeons and filthy corners where prisoners wasted away chained to stone walls. But that wasn't always the reality. The tower was not originally a prison. It began as a royal residence, and many kings and queens stayed here before their coronations. Anne's predecessor and rival, Catherine of Aragon, also waited here before becoming queen. What's striking is that these very same rooms, which witnessed some of the most important moments of Anne's life, would later play a role in the fate of her daughter, Elizabeth, who would also be imprisoned here by order of her half-sister, Queen Mary, believing she too might never leave these walls alive. During the night of May 18th into the 19th, Anne did not sleep. She only prayed. It is probably difficult to fall asleep at all after everything this woman had endured in the days before. On May 1st, she still sat beside her husband as queen. A day later, she was arrested. Then she stood trial, was condemned for treason, watched the downfall of many people close to her, and among them lost her own brother, George Boleyn. Only yesterday, she herself had expected to die before her execution was suddenly delayed. So, the last weeks of Anne's life had become a waking nightmare. Yet, waiting one more day for death may have been the most unbearable cruelty of all. We do not know what occupied Anne's mind during those heavy final hours. Was she thinking about Henry's vile betrayal, about the fate of her daughter, or perhaps still holding on to some fragile hope for mercy? Yet strangely enough, we know with almost complete certainty nearly every word she spoke and almost every movement she made. Everything Anne said was carefully documented by the constable of the Tower, Sir Kingston. And among the 4 women attending her in those final days, one was reportedly acting as a spy, relaying the smallest details to Thomas Cromwell and to Anne's bitter enemy, the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis. So Anne spent her final morning not surrounded by close friends, who might have offered comfort, but among women of whom she herself complained, saying there was much unkindness in the king to put such about me as I never loved. The final companions of her last days were Elizabeth Stoner, Mary Kingston, Margaret Coffin, and one of Anne's paternal aunts, who also carried the Boleyn name. When Anne complained that the women might report her conversations, her aunt reportedly answered coldly, "Such desire as you have had to such tales has brought you to this." So, perhaps, do not trust those gentle scenes from the Tudors, where Anne chats warmly with these women. I think Anne understood very well that some of them were watching her, and that even in front of them she had to keep up appearances and weigh every word she spoke. So either way, everyone who encountered Anne that final morning noted her extraordinary composure, calmness, and self-control. Sir Kingston later recalled that day saying, "Seemed more ready to die than any creature I ever saw." At 7 in the morning, Anne received communion, and before taking it, she swore again and again that she was innocent. According to her own sworn enemy, Eustace Chapuis, Anne even swore upon her soul that she had never been unfaithful to the king. And I have to admit, standing on the edge of death, considering how deeply religious a woman she was, I find it difficult to believe she would have lied, especially while swearing upon her own soul. After communion, Anne was served a light breakfast. Unfortunately, the details of her final meal are unknown to us, but it was likely something simple. Broth, bread, perhaps wine, though I honestly wonder whether Anne could swallow even a single bite, or whether she had any appetite left at all. Interestingly, we do know some of the expenses Henry incurred for Anne Boleyn's execution, and among them was the equivalent of nearly $11,000 in today's money spent on food alone, which, you'll agree, is hardly a small amount. So, at the very least, I'd like to believe Anne was provided conditions still worthy of a queen. But what about the rest of the costs? After Anne's death, Henry paid £100 to reclaim her jewels and clothing from the Tower, which would equal roughly $44,000 today. He paid the executioner £25 and 4 shillings, equivalent to around $10,000 in modern money, and £20 in charitable donations, which today would amount to nearly $8,000. So, in total, the approximate cost of arranging the death of his second wife came to around $70,000. While the former queen was preparing for death, outside, only a few metres from her residence on Tower Green, the scaffold was already waiting for her. It had been covered with black cloth and strewn with straw meant to absorb the blood. But there was one unusual detail. There was no wooden execution block, the kind normally used for beheadings. The reason was that Henry VIII had arranged one final farewell gift for his wife. Cruel as that may sound, by his order, a specially trained swordsman had been brought from Calais, capable of carrying out the execution with a sword rather than an axe. At the time, death by sword was considered less painful and was regarded as something of a specialised art, practised far more often in France than in England. So even here, you can still see Anne's particular connection to France. Interestingly, the delay of the executioner's arrival is often considered the main reason Anne's execution was postponed. But there is another theory. It is possible the delay was intentional, that Henry wanted time to clear the Tower of foreign visitors and ambassadors who had gathered hoping to witness the death of a queen, and who undoubtedly would have written letters describing every detail to Europe's royal courts. Anne's execution was already shocking enough for the whole of Europe, and perhaps Henry still wished to preserve at least some appearance of dignity in the eyes of the world. Either way, the Queen's death did not go unnoticed. Among the crowd already waiting beside the scaffold were many familiar faces to Anne, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, her sworn enemy Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated much of what had happened to her during those final weeks, and Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. At 8 in the morning, the constable appeared and informed Anne that the hour of her death was near, and that she should prepare herself. But Anne was already prepared. Many who saw her that day remarked not only on her composure, but also on her beauty. One Portuguese witness, who later wrote an account of the events of that May morning, said, "Never had the Queen looked so beautiful." Anne had clearly paid particular attention to her appearance that day, perhaps leaving several hidden messages within her clothing. The ermine trimming on her gown reaffirmed her status, because in her own eyes, she was still a queen. Her petticoat was crimson, the colour of martyrdom, and for her headdress, she chose an English gable hood, rather than the decorative French hood she had so often favoured. Perhaps on this final day, Anne wished to appear solemn, and unmistakably English. Accompanied by Sir Kingston, Anne made her final walk. She passed the Great Hall, moved through Cold Harbour Gate, along the western side of the White Tower, and slowly approached the scaffold. Witnesses wrote that she walked with a goodly countenance, carrying herself with dignity. Others described her appearance as possessing a devilish spirit, and said she looked as gay as if she was not going to die. Standing on the scaffold, Anne delivered a short speech that many of you have probably heard before. But here you might ask, why didn't Anne simply say what she truly thought? Why didn't she stand there and call Henry cruel, condemn him, tell the crowd she hated him? Because, let's be honest, standing before death, most people would want to speak every thought they had kept inside. But Anne could not take that risk, because Henry held not only her fate in his hands, but Elizabeth's as well, along with the lives of other members of her family. He still had the power to imprison them, to destroy them, even to order their deaths. And Anne was not willing to gamble with her daughter's safety. That is why her speech was carefully measured. She confessed to no crime. Instead, she asked those present to pray for the king, calling him gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and saying that he had always shown her kindness. Then Anne's ladies removed her mantle. Anne took off her hood and carefully tucked her famous dark hair beneath the cap so that it would not fall beneath the sword. Anna paid the executioner, and, as was customary at the time, he asked for her forgiveness. Then Anne lowered herself to her knees and began to pray. "Oh Christ, receive my spirit," she said as she waited. The executioner had hidden his sword beneath the straw. He distracted Anne for a brief moment, and then, in a single swift blow, severed her head. According to some witnesses, her lips continued to move for several seconds afterwards. This is not some mystery of higher powers, but simply the final residual movements of the nervous system, which does not cease functioning instantly. And interestingly, I once read an analysis discussing whether Anne might actually have felt pain at the moment of execution. The conclusion was that probably not, because the nervous system would simply not have had enough time to transmit the signal to the brain within those few fractions of a second. So perhaps there is at least some comfort in believing she did not endure the prolonged suffering seen in other executions, as was the case, for example, with Margaret Pole. It was around 8:20 in the morning when Anne Boleyn was now dead, and in some sense, perhaps, finally free. Cannons fired from the tower to signify her death. The sound echoed across London, and it was the sound Henry had been waiting for. Within the next 24 hours, Henry and Jane Seymour would become engaged, and only 11 days later, they would marry. And of course, there is something deeply chilling in that coldness. Celebrating an engagement and wedding while the body of your former wife had scarcely gone cold. The woman with whom you had shared nearly a decade of your life, and who was the mother of your child. Anne's ladies wrapped her head and body in white cloth and placed her into an old elm chest that had once been used to store arrows, because nothing had been prepared for her burial. Henry and Cromwell had thought through every detail of how to get rid of Anne, yet they had not granted her even a proper coffin. So, for some time, her body remained lying near the scaffold before it was finally carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the walls of the tower. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England and mother of the future Queen Elizabeth, was buried in an unmarked grave as a traitor. Only centuries later, during the reign of Queen Victoria, in 1877, when the chapel underwent restoration, Anne's remains were identified and reburied. And at last, she received a marker at the place of her final rest, in the very place where everything for her had once begun, and where everything for her had ended. Since then, every year on May 19th, the anniversary of Queen Anne Boleyn's execution, a bouquet of red roses, said to have been her favourite flowers, is placed on her grave. For a long time, Tower staff wondered who could be sending them, until an investigation eventually revealed that the flowers came from a family in Kent who believed themselves to be descendants of the Boleyns and who had arranged an anonymous contract with a florist. And if one day you happen to find yourself in London, make sure to visit the Tower of London and bring Anne red roses as well. Perhaps if you've come across my channel by chance, you might be wondering what the point is in remembering an execution that happened nearly 500 years ago. After all, history does not change because we revisit it. Yes, there was once such a queen. Yes, she died. But I think Anne Boleyn's story still resonates with so many people because it was never simply the story of one execution. It is the story of betrayal by someone you loved. It is the story of a woman fighting against injustice. It is the story of meeting even the cruelest turns of fate with dignity and courage, as Anne did. And perhaps that is why her story continues to endure. Because within it, almost everyone can recognize something they have seen or experienced in their own lives. That is why, nearly 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn still occupies such a lasting place in people's hearts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check once again whether you've left a like. And let's speculate together in the comments. What do you think would have happened if Anne had not been executed that day? How differently might history have unfolded? See you in the next video.